There is something in your blood right now that wasn't there when your grandfather was born. It is in the water you drank this morning. It is in the rain falling over the Amazon rainforest and in the snow settling on the peaks of the Himalayas. It is in the liver of polar bears in the Arctic Circle and in the bloodstream of newborn babies in Tokyo, London, and New York. It does not belong there. It does not exist in nature. God didn't create it. A corporation did. For the last 50 years, we have all been unwitting participants in a massive secret biological experiment run by one of the most powerful industrial empires on Earth. They didn't use lab rats for this experiment. They didn't use monkeys. They used us. They used the entire human population as a filtration system for their toxic waste. And the most terrifying part isn't that they poisoned the world by accident. Accidents happen. Industrial spills happen. No, the terrifying part is that they knew. They knew for decades that their product was leaching into the water supply. They knew it was causing organ failure and cancer in their own workers. They knew it would never, ever break down in the environment. But they sat in boardrooms, looked at the spreadsheets, and made a cold, hard calculation. They decided that the billions of dollars in profit they were making were worth the cost of poisoning 99% of life on this planet. This is not a story about science. This is a story about the economics of evil. This is the story of the company that privatized the profits and socialized the poison. To understand the crime, we first have to understand the miracle. The story begins in the shadow of World War II, a time when American industry was ramping up to unimaginable levels of production. The year was 1938. In a laboratory in New Jersey, a young chemist named Roy Plunkett was working for DuPont, the massive chemical conglomerate that had already revolutionized the world with the invention of nylon and rayon. Plunkett wasn't looking for a poison, he was looking for a better refrigerator. Back then, fridges used toxic, flammable gases like ammonia and sulfur dioxide. If a pipe leaked in the middle of the night, entire families would die in their sleep. It was a common tragedy. DuPont wanted to capture the market by creating a safe, non-toxic coolant gas. Plunkett was experimenting with a gas called tetrafluoroethylene, or TFE. It was a simple molecule, just carbon and fluorine. One morning, Plunkett walked into the lab to prepare a batch. He opened the valve on a pressurized cylinder of TFE, expecting the gas to hiss out. But nothing happened. The valve was open, but the tank was silent. Plunkett was confused. He lifted the tank. It was heavy. It was full. The gas hadn't leaked out, but it wasn't coming out either. Driven by scientific curiosity, Plunkett took a saw and cut the metal cylinder in half. Inside, he found something that defied the laws of physics as he knew them. The gas had disappeared. In its place was a white, waxy powder that coated the inside of the tank. He touched it. It was slippery, more slippery than ice. He tried to dissolve it with water. Nothing happened. He tried to dissolve it with acid. Nothing. He tried to burn it, freeze it, electric shock it. The white powder was invincible. Plunkett had accidentally discovered the strongest chemical bond in the entire universe, the carbon-fluorine bond. In the world of chemistry, fluorine is the greediest element in existence. It grabs onto carbon electrons and holds them so tightly that almost nothing can break them apart. It creates a molecular shield that is impervious to heat, water, and corrosion. DuPont realized almost immediately that they weren't just sitting on a failed refrigerant. They were sitting on a gold mine. The U.S. military, deep in the Manhattan Project, heard about this new substance. They were struggling to build the atomic bomb because the uranium hexafluoride gas used to enrich fuel was so corrosive, it kept eating through the pipes and seals of their factories. They needed a shield. This white powder, which DuPont branded as Teflon, was the answer. It was the only material on Earth that could withstand the atomic age. When the war ended, DuPont took their wartime secret and unleashed it on the consumer market. They marketed it as a miracle of modern living. Better living through chemistry, that was the slogan. By the 1960s, Teflon was everywhere. It was on the frying pans that made your eggs slide right onto the plate. It was in the stain-resistant carpets in your living room. It was on the waterproof raincoat you wore to work. It coated the medical implants in your grandmother's hips and the wires in the space shuttle. By the 1990s, the Teflon division was generating over $1 billion a year in pure profit for DuPont. It was the crown jewel of their empire. But there was a dirty secret behind the miracle. Manufacturing Teflon wasn't easy. The white powder was so slippery and so stubborn that it was nearly impossible to work with. To turn it into a liquid that could be sprayed onto a pan or pumped through a machine, they needed a chemical soap. They needed a surfactant. So in 1951, DuPont began purchasing a specific chemical from another industrial giant, 3M. This chemical was PFOA, also known as C8. C8 was a technological marvel. It had a head that loved water and a tail made of those indestructible carbon-fluorine bonds that repelled everything. It allowed DuPont to smoothen out the Teflon, to mold it, to sell it. C8 was the invisible engine behind the billion-dollar profits. But C8 had a flaw. It was virtually indestructible. Because the carbon-fluorine bond is so strong, nature has no mechanism to break it down. It doesn't decompose like an apple core. It doesn't rust like iron. If you bury it in the ground, it stays there. If you dump it in the river, it floats forever. And if you drink it, it stays in you. This is where the story shifts from innovation to negligence. Parkersburg, West Virginia is a small working-class town on the banks of the Ohio River. For decades, it was known as a DuPont town. The company bought the land, built the massive Washington Works factory, and employed thousands of local residents. DuPont paid for the libraries. They paid for the schools. They sponsored the Little League teams. In Parkersburg, you didn't question DuPont. They were the economic heartbeat of the region. But in the late 1990s, things started to go wrong on a farm just a few miles downriver from the plant. A cattle farmer named Earl Tennant began noticing a change in his herd. Earl was a simple man, but he knew his animals. He watched as his cows, which had always been healthy and docile, started to waste away. They grew thin, their ribs poking through their skin like skeletons. They developed strange lesions and tumors. Then they started to go insane. When Earl approached them, they would charge at him with a wild, demonic look in their eyes. Calves were born blind or with blackened teeth. In a span of a few years, Earl lost his entire herd. Over 150 cows died in agony. Earl suspected the water. A creek ran through his property. A creek that sat directly next to a landfill owned by DuPont. He had seen a pipe dumping sludge into the water. He had seen the water turn bubbly and white, foaming like soap. He took samples. He recorded videos on his camcorder, narrating the horror show of his dying farm, zooming in on the green entrails of the cows he dissected himself. He went to the Environmental Protection Agency. He went to the state regulators. He pleaded for help. And this is where we see the first crack in the system. The regulators looked at the water reports and told Earl everything was fine. They checked the list of regulated chemicals and the water was clear. There was no arsenic, no lead, no mercury. According to the law, the water was safe. Earl was told he was crazy, that his cows were dying of poor nutrition or a virus. But Earl knew what he saw. The water was poison. The problem wasn't that the water was clean. The problem was that the poison in the water didn't have a name. It wasn't on the EPA's list. It was a trade secret. C8 wasn't regulated because, as far as the U.S. government was concerned, C8 didn't exist. Desperate and ostracized by a town that viewed DuPont as a savior, Earl Tennant did the only thing he had left. He called a lawyer. He found a man named Rob Bilott. It was an unlikely pairing. Bilott wasn't an environmental crusader. He was a corporate defense attorney at a high-end firm in Cincinnati. His job was usually to defend chemical companies, not sue them. But Bilott had a connection to Parkersburg. His grandmother lived there. He agreed to meet Earl as a favor. When he sat in his office and watched Earl S. grainy VHS tapes, watched the cows stumbling and dying, saw the white foam on the creek, he knew this wasn't natural. Bilott filed a lawsuit. It was supposed to be a small case, a local dispute over cattle. But during the discovery process, he demanded that DuPont hand over their internal documents regarding the landfill. DuPont, perhaps thinking they could bury the single lawyer in paperwork, sent him everything. They sent him dozens of boxes containing over 110,000 pages of internal memos, medical reports, and private emails dating back 50 years. They expected him to give up. They expected him to drown in the data. They were wrong. Rob Bilott sat on the floor of his office, surrounded by towers of paper, and he started to read. He read every single page, and as he pieced the timeline together, the blood drained from his face. He realized he wasn't looking at a case of cattle poisoning. He was looking at the incriminating diary of a serial killer. The documents revealed that DuPont wasn't just negligent. They were fully aware of what they were doing. They had known for 40 years that C8 was toxic. They had known it was accumulating in the bodies of their workers. They had known it was leaking into the drinking water, and they had spent decades covering it up. The documents painted a picture of cold corporate sociopathy. The timeline of the cover-up didn't start in the 90s. It started in 1961. That year, DuPont AS own toxicologists discovered that C8 caused the livers of rats to increase in size and eventually fail. They knew it was toxic. By 1962, they had replicated the study in dogs. The results were fatal, but instead of halting production, they simply marked the documents confidential and kept the factory lines running. Then came the human experiments. They weren't official clinical trials, of course. They were observations of their own staff. In the late 1970s, DuPont and 3M realized something terrifying. The chemical was binding to the blood proteins of their employees. They started monitoring a group of pregnant women working in the Teflon division. Out of 7 births, 2 of the babies were born with defects. One child had eye defects. Another was born with a single nostril and facial deformities. DuPont knew C8 crossed the placenta. They knew it poisoned the fetus. Did they call the FDA? Did they warn the public? No. They quietly moved the women out of the Teflon division, buried the file in the archives, and never spoke of it again. But the most damning document Rob Bilott found was a secret study on the water supply. By the 1980s, DuPont suspected that C8 was escaping the factory. It was drifting out of the smokestacks and seeping into the ground. They sent a team to test the drinking water in the local districts around Parkersburg. They found C8 in the taps of gas stations, schools, and private homes. The poison was out of the bottle. This was the moment of decision. This was the moment DuPont could have saved thousands of lives. They held a meeting at their headquarters in Delaware to discuss the C8 issue. Their own scientists did the math. They calculated a safe limit for C8 in drinking water, 1 part per billion. It was a minuscule amount, essentially a single drop in an Olympic swimming pool. But when they looked at the test results from the local water district, the levels weren't 1 part per billion. They were 3 parts, 5 parts, sometimes higher. The executives looked at the data. They looked at the billion-dollar revenue stream from Teflon, and then they made the calculus of evil. The documents show that they considered installing a filtration system to scrub the C8 from the factory waste. It would have cost roughly $1 million, a rounding error for a company of their size, but they decided against it. Why? Because buying a filter would be an admission of guilt. It would be admitting that there was something to filter. It would trigger regulations. It would alert the EPA. Instead of spending $1 million to save the town, they chose to spend nothing. In fact, they doubled down. They ramped up production. They dumped thousands of tons of C8 sludge into unlined pits in the ground, knowing full well it would rain, dissolve, and flow directly into the aquifer that supplied drinking water to 70,000 people. They didn't just poison Earl Tennant's cows, they poisoned the entire community's morning coffee, their baby formula, and their bathwater. And they did it to save a fraction of a percent on their bottom line. Rob Bilott had the smoking gun. But having the truth and winning in court are two different things. He was one man against a multinational empire with unlimited legal resources. He filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of the 70,000 people in the affected water districts. DuPont fought him with everything they had. They denied the science. They claimed C8 was harmless. They claimed the dosage was too low to matter. They tried to bury him in procedural delays, dragging the case out for years, hoping he would go bankrupt or give up. But Bilott made a strategic move that would change history. He realized that arguing in court about potential harm wasn't enough. He needed irrefutable proof. He needed to prove that C8 caused cancer in humans, not just rats. So, he leveraged the settlement to force DuPont to fund the largest epidemiological study in human history. He set up the C8 Science Panel. The deal was simple but massive. DuPont would pay for blood tests for everyone in the contaminated area. If the independent scientists found no link between C8 and disease, the lawsuit would end and DuPont would walk free. But if they did find a link, DuPont would be on the hook for everything. It was a gamble. DuPont was confident. They believed their own propaganda. They thought the levels were too low to prove anything. But the people of Parkersburg wanted answers. In a massive display of community solidarity, nearly 70,000 people lined up to give blood. They gave their medical histories. They gave their trust. It took the science panel 7 years to analyze the data. 7 years of waiting. 7 years of people getting sick, developing tumors, and dying while the lawyers argued in sterile rooms. In 2011, the results finally came back. The science panel released their report. It was devastating. They found a probable link between C8 exposure and 6 serious conditions: kidney cancer, testicular cancer, ulcerative colitis, thyroid disease, preeclampsia, and high cholesterol. The gamble had failed for DuPont. The truth was written in the blood of 70,000 people. DuPont eventually settled the class action for $671 million. It sounds like a victory. It sounds like justice. But let's look at the economics again. $671 million. In the years that DuPont was poisoning the water, the Teflon division made tens of billions in profit. The fine was less than 2 weeks of their total corporate revenue. They paid the fine, and their stock price barely moved. From a purely financial perspective, poisoning the town was a smart investment. They got away with it for decades, made a fortune, and paid a speeding ticket at the end. But the story doesn't end in Parkersburg. If this was just a tragedy about one town in West Virginia, it would be bad enough. But C8 doesn't stay in one place. Remember, it's a forever chemical. It travels in water. It travels in air. While DuPont was fighting the lawsuit, researchers started testing blood samples from people who had never been to West Virginia. They tested people in New York. They tested people in Seattle. They tested people in Europe. They found C8 everywhere. The chemical had hitched a ride on the clouds. It had moved through the ocean currents. It had entered the food chain. Because C8 was used in fast food wrappers, pizza boxes, and microwave popcorn bags, it had migrated directly into the food supply. By the time the lawsuit was settled, scientists estimated that 99% of the American population, and a vast majority of the global population, had C8 in their blood. If you are watching this, you have C8 in you. It is binding to your proteins right now, and because your body has no way to break down that carbon-fluorine bond, it accumulates. Every time you drink contaminated water, every time you eat from a contaminated wrapper, the level rises. You're a biological containment vessel for DuPont's waste. And this brings us to the final, most cynical act of the story, the corporate shell game. By 2015, DuPont saw the writing on the wall. The science was out. The lawsuits were piling up, not just from Parkersburg, but from all over the world. They knew that eventually the bill for cleaning up the planet would come due, and that bill would be in the billions, maybe even the trillions. It was a liability large enough to bankrupt the entire company. So they did what any smart financial empire would do. They rearranged the furniture to hide the money. DuPont executed a corporate spin-off. They took their entire performance chemicals division, the part of the company responsible for Teflon and the C8 pollution, and they turned it into a completely new, separate company called the Chemours Company. On paper, this looked like a standard business move, but in reality, it was a getaway car. DuPont offloaded the factories, the employees, and most importantly, the legal liabilities onto Chemours. They loaded this new company with debt and cast it out to sea. The idea was simple. If the lawsuits became too expensive, Chemours would go bankrupt, destroying the liability, while the original DuPont, now merged with Dow Chemical, would stay safe, keeping the profits they had made for the last 50 years. They essentially laundered the company to wash away the crime. But they didn't just wash away the crime, they restarted it. Because they couldn't use C8 anymore, the industry needed a replacement. They needed a chemical that did the exact same thing but wasn't technically C8. So the chemists went back to the lab. They looked at the C8 molecule, a chain of 8 carbon atoms, and they simply snipped the end off. They created a chain with 6 carbon atoms. They called it Gen X. They presented Gen X to the regulators as a new, sustainable alternative. They claimed it was safer because it had a shorter half-life in the human body. Because it was a new chemical, it wasn't subject to the old regulations. It was innocent until proven guilty. And just like that, the factories started pumping again. Gen X flowed into the water. It flowed into the air. But science is catching up again. Recent studies on Gen X are showing the exact same red flags we saw 50 years ago. It causes tumors in rats. It damages the liver. It affects the immune system. We are repeating the exact same cycle, just with 2 fewer carbon atoms. It is a game of chemical whack-a-mole. The moment we ban one, they invent another that is 99% identical, and the clock starts over for another 40 years of lawsuits. Today, the situation has reached what scientists call planetary saturation. The levels of PFAS, the family of chemicals C8 belongs to, in rainwater are now frequently higher than the safety limits set by the EPA. This means that even if you live off the grid, grow your own food, and dig your own well, you cannot escape it. The rain itself is technically illegal to drink. The economic reality of this is staggering. A recent study estimated that the healthcare costs associated with PFAS exposure in Europe alone are over $50 billion per year. That is money paid by taxpayers. That is money paid by you through your insurance premiums, your taxes, and your hospital bills. Meanwhile, the companies that cause this damage continue to report quarterly profits. This is the ultimate lesson of the DuPont scandal. It forces us to ask a fundamental question about our economic system. What is the price of a product? When you bought a nonstick pan in 1990 for $20, you thought that was the price, but it wasn't. The real price was hidden. The real price was the chemotherapy for a farmer in West Virginia. The real price was the filtration plant that your city now has to build for $50 million. The real price is the chemical circulating in your child's blood. We paid $20, but the true cost was subsidized by our health. The empire of DuPont was built on a lie. They privatized the profits, keeping the billions for their shareholders, and they socialized the losses, spreading the poison to every living thing on Earth. They treated the environment not as a resource to be protected, but as a balance sheet item to be exploited. And the scariest part? C8 is just one chemical. There are over 14,000 different PFAS compounds currently in use in the global market. The vast majority of them are still considered trade secrets. We don't know what they are. We don't know what they do. We are walking blindfolded through a chemical minefield laid by corporations that view our survival as a secondary concern to their stock price. History is often told through the lens of wars and kings, but the true history of the modern world is written in the fine print of chemical patents and legal settlements. It is a history of silent conquests, where the weapon isn't a gun, but a molecule. And in this war, there are no bystanders. We are all on the battlefield. So, the next time you drink a glass of water, remember this story. Remember that the clarity of the water is an illusion. And remember that, in the eyes of an empire, you are not a customer, and you are not a citizen. You are simply overhead.